Section 51. Being towards death and the everydayness of Dasein. In setting forth average everyday being towards death, we must take our orientation from those structures of everydayness at which we have earlier arrived. In being towards death, Dasein comports itself towards itself as a distinctive potentiality for being. But the self of everydayness is the they. The they is constituted by the way things have been publicly interpreted, which expresses itself in idle talk. Idle talk must accordingly make manifest the way in which everyday Dasein interprets for itself its being towards death. The foundation of any interpretation is an act of understanding, which is always accompanied by a state of mind, or, in other words, which has a mood. So we must ask how being towards death is disclosed by the kind of understanding which, with its state of mind, lurks in the idle talk of the they. How does the they comport itself understandingly towards that ownmost possibility of Dasein which is non-relational and is not to be outstripped? What state of mind discloses to the they that it has been delivered over to death, and in what way? In the publicness with which we are with one another in our everyday manner, death is known as a mishap which is constantly occurring, as a case of death. Someone or other dies, be he neighbor or stranger, Nächster oder Fernerstehende. People who are no acquaintances of ours are dying daily and hourly. Death is encountered as a well-known event occurring within the world. As such, it remains in the inconspicuousness characteristic of what is encountered in an everyday fashion. The they has already stowed away, gesichert, an interpretation for this event. It talks of it in a fugitive manner, either expressly or else in a way which is mostly inhibited. As if to say, one of these days one will die too in the end, but right now it has nothing to do with us. The analysis of the phrase, one dies, reveals unambiguously the kind of being which belongs to everyday being towards death. In such a way of talking, death is understood as an indefinite something which, above all, must duly arrive from somewhere or other, but which is proximally not yet present at hand for oneself, and is therefore no threat. The expression one dies spreads abroad the opinion that what gets reached, as it were, by death is the they. In Dasein's public way of interpreting, it is said that one dies because everyone else and oneself can talk himself into saying that in no case is it I myself, for this one is the nobody. Dying is levelled off to an occurrence which reaches Dasein, to be sure, but belongs to nobody in particular. If idle talk is always ambiguous, so is this manner of talking about death. Dying, which is essentially mine in such a way that no one can be my representative, is perverted into an event of public occurrence which the they encounters. In the way of talking which we have characterized, death is spoken of as a case which is constantly occurring. Death gets passed off as always something actual. Its character as a possibility gets concealed, and so are the other two items that belong to it, the fact that it is non-relational and that it is not to be outstripped. By such ambiguity, Dasein puts itself in the position of losing itself in the they, as regards a distinctive potentiality for being which belongs to Dasein's ownmost self. The they gives its approval, and aggravates the temptation to cover up from oneself one's ownmost being towards death. This evasive concealment in the face of death dominates everydayness so stubbornly that, in being with one another, the neighbours often still keep talking the dying person into the belief that he will escape death and soon return to the tranquilized everydayness of the world of his concern. Such solicitude is meant to console him. It insists upon bringing him back into Dasein, while in addition it helps him to keep his ownmost non-relational possibility of being completely concealed. In this manner the they provides, besorgt, a constant tranquilization about death. At bottom, however, this is a tranquilization not only for him who is dying, but just as much for those who console him, and even in the case of a demise, the public is still not to have its own tranquillity upset by such an event, or be disturbed in the carefreeness with which it concerns itself. Indeed, the dying of others is seen often enough as a social inconvenience, if not even a downright tactlessness, against which the public is to be guarded. But along with this tranquilization, which forces Dasein away from its death, the they at the same time puts itself in the right, and makes itself respectable, by tacitly regulating the way in which one has to comport oneself towards death. It is already a matter of public acceptance that thinking about death is a cowardly fear, a sign of insecurity on the part of Dasein, and a sombre way of fleeing from the world. The they does not permit us the courage for anxiety in the face of death. The dominance of the manner in which things have been publicly interpreted by the they has already decided what state of mind is to determine our attitude towards death. In anxiety in the face of death, Dasein is brought face to face with itself as delivered over to that possibility which is not to be outstripped. The they concerns itself with transforming this anxiety into fear in the face of an oncoming event. In addition, the anxiety which has been made ambiguous as fear is passed off as a weakness with which no self-assured Dasein may have any acquaintance. What is fitting, was sich gehört, according to the unuttered decree of the they, is indifferent tranquillity as to the fact that one dies. The cultivation of such a superior indifference alienates Dasein from its own most non-relational potentiality for being. But temptation, tranquilization, and alienation are distinguishing marks of the kind of being called falling, as falling, everyday being towards death, is a constant fleeing in the face of death. Being towards the end has the mode of evasion in the face of it, giving new explanations for it, understanding it inauthentically, and concealing it. Practically, one's own Dasein is always dying already, that is to say, it is in a being towards its end, and it hides this fact from itself by recoining death as just a case of death in others, an everyday occurrence which, if need be, gives us the assurance still more plainly that oneself is still living. But in thus falling and fleeing in the face of death, Dasein's everydayness attests that the very they itself already has the definite character of being towards death, even when it is not explicitly engaged in thinking about death. Even in average everydayness, this ownmost potentiality for being, which is non-relational and not to be outstripped, is constantly an issue for Dasein. This is the case when its concern is merely in the mode of an untroubled indifference towards the uttermost possibility of existence. In setting forth everyday being towards death, however, we are at the same time enjoined to try to secure a full existential conception of being towards the end, by a more penetrating interpretation in which falling, being towards death, is taken as an evasion in the face of death, that in the face of which one flees has been made visible in a way which is phenomenally adequate. Against this it must be possible to project phenomenologically the way in which evasive Dasein itself understands its death. Death. Section 52. Everyday being towards the end and the full existential conception of death. In our preliminary existential sketch, being towards the end has been defined as being towards one's ownmost potentiality for being, which is non-relational and is not to be outstripped. Being towards this possibility as a being which exists is brought face to face with the absolute impossibility of existence. Beyond this seemingly empty characterization of being towards death, there has been revealed the concretion of this being in the mode of everydayness. In accordance with the tendency to falling, which is essential to everydayness, being towards death has turned out to be an evasion in the face of death, an evasion which conceals. While our investigation has hitherto passed from a formal sketch of the ontological structure of death to the concrete analysis of everyday being towards the end, the direction is now to be reversed, and we shall arrive at the full existential conception of death by rounding out our interpretation of everyday being towards the end. In explicating everyday being towards death, we have clung to the idle talk of the they, to the effect that one dies too, some time, but not right away. All that we have interpreted thus far is the one dies as such. In the sometime, but not right away, everydayness concedes something like a certainty of death. Nobody doubts that one dies. On the other hand, this not doubting need not imply that kind of being certain which corresponds to the way death, in the sense of the distinctive possibility characterized above, enters into Dasein. Everydayness confines itself to conceding the certainty of death in this ambiguous manner just in order to weaken that certainty by covering up dying still more and to alleviate its own throwness into death. By its very meaning, this evasive concealment in the face of death cannot be authentically certain of death, and yet it is certain of it. What are we to say about the certainty of death? To be certain of an entity means to hold it for true as something true. But truth signifies the uncoveredness of some entity, and all uncoveredness is grounded ontologically in the most primordial truth, the disclosedness of Dasein. As an entity which is both disclosed and disclosing, and one which uncovers, Dasein is essentially in the truth. But certainty is grounded in the truth or belongs to it equiprimordially. The expression certainty, like the term truth, has a double signification. Primordially, truth means the same as being disclosive, as a way in which Dasein behaves. From this comes the derivative signification, the uncoveredness of entities. Correspondingly, certainty in its primordial signification is tantamount to being certain, as a kind of being which belongs to Dasein. However, in a derivative signification, any entity of which Dasein can be certain will also get called something certain. One mode of certainty is conviction. In conviction, Dasein lets the testimony of the thing itself which has been uncovered, the true thing itself, be the sole determinant for its being towards that thing understandingly. Holding something for true is adequate as a way of maintaining oneself in the truth, if it is grounded in the uncovered entity itself, and if, as being towards the entity so uncovered, it has become transparent to itself as regards its appropriateness to that entity. In any arbitrary fiction, or in merely having some view, Ansicht, about an entity, this sort of thing is lacking. The adequacy of holding for true is measured according to the truth claim to which it belongs. Such a claim gets its justification from the kind of being of the entity to be disclosed, and from the direction of the disclosure. The kind of truth, and along with it the certainty, varies with the way entities differ, and accords with the guiding tendency and extent of the disclosure. Our present considerations will be restricted to an analysis of being certain with regard to death, and this being certain will in the end present us with a distinctive certainty of Dasein. For the most part, everyday Dasein covers up the ownmost possibility of its being, that possibility which is non-relational and not to be outstripped. This factical tendency to cover up confirms our thesis that Dasein, as factical, is in the untruth. Therefore, the certainty which belongs to such a covering up of being towards death must be an inappropriate way of holding for true, and not, for instance, an uncertainty in the sense of a doubting. In inappropriate certainty, that of which one is certain is held covered up. If one understands death as an event which one encounters in one's environment, then the certainty which is related to such events does not pertain to being towards the end. They say it is certain that death is coming. They say it, and the they overlooks the fact that, in order to be able to be certain of death, Dasein itself must in every case be certain of its ownmost non-relational potentiality for being. They say death is certain, and in saying so they implant in Dasein the illusion that it is itself certain of its death. And what is the ground of everyday being certain? Manifestly it is not just mutual persuasion. Yet the dying of others is something that one experiences daily. Death is an undeniable fact of experience. The way in which everyday being towards death understands the certainty which is thus grounded betrays itself when it tries to think about death, even when it does so with critical foresight, that is to say, in an appropriate manner. So far as one knows, all men die. Death is probable in the highest degree for every man, yet it is not unconditionally certain. Taken strictly, a certainty which is only empirical may be attributed to death. Such certainty necessarily falls short of the highest certainty, the apodictic, which we reach in certain domains of theoretical knowledge. In this critical determination of the certainty of death and of its impendence, what is manifested in the first instance is once again a failure to recognize Dasein's kind of being, and the being towards death which belongs to Dasein, a failure that is characteristic of everydayness. The fact that demise, as an event which occurs, is only empirically certain, is in no way decisive as to the certainty of death. Cases of death may be the factical occasion for Dasein's first paying attention to death at all. So long, however, as Dasein remains in the empirical certainty which we have mentioned, death, in the way that it is something of which Dasein can by no means become certain. Even though, in the publicness of the they, Dasein seems to talk only of this empirical certainty of death, nevertheless at bottom, Dasein does not exclusively or primarily stick to those cases of death which merely occur. In evading its death, even everyday being towards the end is indeed certain of its death in another way than it might itself like to have true on purely theoretical considerations. This other way is what everydayness for the most part veils from itself. Everydayness does not dare to let itself become transparent in such a manner. We have already characterized the everyday state of mind which consists in an air of superiority with regard to the certain fact of death, a superiority which is anxiously concerned while seemingly free from anxiety. In this state of mind, everydayness acknowledges a higher certainty than one which is only empirical. One knows about the certainty of death, and yet is not authentically certain of one's own. The falling everydayness of Dasein is acquainted with death's certainty, and yet evades being certain. But in the light of what it evades, this very evasion attests phenomenally that death must be conceived as one's ownmost possibility, non-relational, not to be outstripped, and above all, certain. One says, death certainly comes, but not right away. With this but, the they denies that death is certain. Not right away is not a purely negative assertion, but a way in which the they interprets itself. With this interpretation, the they refers itself to that which is proximally accessible to Dasein and amenable to its concern. Everydayness forces its way into the urgency of concern, and divests itself of the fetters of a weary, inactive thinking about death. Death is deferred to some time later, and this is done by invoking the so-called general opinion, allgemeine Ermessen. Thus the they covers up what is peculiar in death's certainty, that it is possible at any moment. Along with the certainty of death goes the indefiniteness of its when. Everyday being towards death evades this indefiniteness by conferring definiteness upon it. But such a procedure cannot signify calculating when the demise is due to arrive. In the face of definiteness such as this, Dasein would sooner flee. Everyday concern makes definite for itself the indefiniteness of certain death by interposing before it those urgencies and possibilities which can be taken in at a glance, and which belong to the everyday matters that are closest to us. But when this indefiniteness has been covered up, the certainty has been covered up too. Thus death's ownmost character as a possibility gets veiled, a possibility which is certain and at the same time indefinite, that is to say, possible at any moment. Now that we have completed our interpretation of the everyday manner in which the they talks about death and the way death enters into Dasein, we have been led to the characters of certainty and indefiniteness. The full, existential, ontological conception of death may now be defined as follows. Death, as the end of Dasein, is Dasein's ownmost possibility, non-relational, certain, and as such indefinite, not to be outstripped. Death is, as Dasein's end, in the being of this entity towards its end. Defining the existential structure of being towards the end helps us to work out a kind of being of Dasein in which Dasein, as Dasein, can be a whole. The fact that even everyday Dasein already is towards its end, that is to say, is constantly coming to grips with its death, though in a fugitive manner, shows that this end, conclusive, abschließende, and determinative for being a whole, is not something to which Dasein ultimately comes only in its demise. In Dasein, as being towards its death, its own uttermost not yet has already been included, that not yet which all others lie ahead of. So if one has given an ontologically inappropriate interpretation of Dasein's not yet as something still outstanding, any formal inference from this to Dasein's lack of totality will not be correct. The phenomenon of the not yet has been taken over from the ahead of itself. No more than the care structure in general can it serve as a higher court which would rule against the possibility of an existent being a whole. Indeed, this ahead of itself is what first of all makes such a being towards the end possible. The problem of the possible being a whole of that entity, which each of us is a correct one, if care, as Dasein's basic state, is connected with death, the uttermost possibility for that entity. Meanwhile, it remains questionable whether this problem has been as yet adequately worked out. Being towards death is grounded in care. Dasein, as throne being in the world, has in every case already been delivered over to its death. In being towards its death, Dasein is dying factically and indeed constantly, as long as it has not yet come to its demise. When we say that Dasein is factically dying, we are saying at the same time that, in its being towards death, Dasein has always decided itself in one way or another. Our everyday falling evasion in the face of death is an inauthentic being towards death. But inauthenticity is based on the possibility of authenticity. Inauthenticity characterizes a kind of being into which Dasein can divert itself, and has for the most part always diverted itself. But Dasein does not necessarily and constantly have to divert itself into this kind of being. Because Dasein exists, it determines its own character as the kind of entity it is, and it does so in every case in terms of a possibility which itself is and which it understands. Can Dasein also understand authentically its ownmost possibility, which is non-relational and not to be outstripped, which is certain and as such indefinite? That is, can Dasein maintain itself in an authentic being towards its end? As long as this authentic being towards death has not been set forth and ontologically defined, there is something essentially lacking in our existential interpretation of being towards the end. Authentic being towards death signifies an existentielle possibility of Dasein. This ontical potentiality for being must, in turn, be ontologically possible. What are the existential conditions of this possibility? How are they themselves to become accessible? Section 53. Existential projection of an authentic being towards death. Factically, Dasein maintains itself proximally and for the most part in an inauthentic being towards death. How is the ontological possibility of an authentic being towards death to be characterized, objectively? If, in the end, Dasein never comports itself authentically towards its end, or if, in accordance with its very meaning, this authentic being must remain hidden from the others. Is it not a fanciful undertaking to project the existential possibility of so questionable an existentielle potentiality for being. What is needed, if such a projection is to go beyond a merely fictitious, arbitrary construction? Does Dasein itself give us any instructions for carrying it out? And can any grounds for its phenomenal legitimacy be taken from Dasein itself? Can our analysis of Dasein up to this point give us any prescriptions for the ontological task we have now set ourselves, so that what we have before us may be kept on a road of which we can be sure? The existential conception of death has been established, and therewith we have also established what it is that an authentic being towards the end should be able to comport itself towards. We have also characterized inauthentic being towards death, and thus we have prescribed in a negative way, prohibitive, how it is possible for authentic being towards death not to be. It is with these positive and prohibitive instructions that the existential edifice of an authentic being towards death must let itself be projected. Dasein is constituted by disclosedness, that is, by an understanding with a state of mind. Authentic being towards death cannot evade its own most non-relational possibility, or cover up this possibility by thus fleeing from it, or give a new explanation for it to accord with the common sense of the they. In our existential projection of an authentic being towards death, therefore, we must set forth those items in such a being which are constitutive for it as an understanding of death, and as such an understanding in the sense of being towards this possibility without either fleeing it or covering it up. In the first instance, we must characterize being towards death as a being towards a possibility, indeed towards a distinctive possibility of Dasein itself. Being towards a possibility, that is to say, towards something possible, may signify being out for something possible, as in concerning ourselves with its actualization. Such possibilities are constantly encountered in the field of what is ready to hand and present at hand, what is attainable, controllable, practicable, and the like. In concernfully being out for something possible, there is a tendency to annihilate the possibility of the possible by making it available to us. But the concernful actualization of equipment which is ready to hand, as in producing it, getting it ready, readjusting it, and so on, is always merely relative, since even that which has been actualized is still characterized in terms of some involvements. Indeed, this is precisely what characterizes its being. Even though actualized, it remains, as actual, something possible for doing something. It is characterized by an in order to. What our analysis is to make plain is simply how being out for something concernfully comports itself towards the possible. It does so not by the theoretico-thematical consideration of the possible as possible, and by having regard for its possibility as such, but rather by looking circumspectively away from the possible and looking at that for which it is possible, das wofür möglich. Manifestly, being towards death, which is now in question, cannot have the character of concernfully being out to get itself actualized. For one thing, death as possible is not something possible which is ready to hand or present at hand, but a possibility of Dasein's being. So, to concern oneself with actualizing what is thus possible would have to signify bringing about one's own demise. But if this were done, Dasein would deprive itself of the very ground for an existing being towards death. Thus, if by being towards death we do not have in view an actualizing of death, neither can we mean dwelling upon the end in its possibility. This is the way one comports oneself when one thinks about death, pondering over when and how this possibility may perhaps be actualized. Of course, such brooding over death does not fully take away from its character as a possibility. Indeed, it always gets brooded over as something that is coming. But in such brooding we weaken it by calculating how we are to have it at our disposal. As something possible, it is to show as little as possible of its possibility. On the other hand, if being towards death has to disclose understandingly the possibility which we have characterized, and if it is to disclose it as a possibility, then in such being towards death this possibility must not be weakened. It must be understood as a possibility. It must be cultivate it as a possibility, and we must put up with it as a possibility, in the way we comport ourselves towards it. However, Dasein comports itself towards something possible in its possibility by expecting it, im Erwarten. Anyone who is intent on something possible may encounter it unimpeded and undiminished in its whether it comes or does not, or whether it comes after all. But with this phenomenon of expecting, has not our analysis reached the same kind of being towards the possible, to which we have already called attention in our description of being out for something concernfully? To expect something possible is always to understand it and to have it with regard to whether and when and how it will be actually present at hand. Expecting is not just an occasional looking away from the possible to its possible actualization, but is essentially a waiting for that actualization, ein Warten auf diese. Even in expecting, one leaps away from the possible and gets a foothold in the actual. It is for its actuality that what is expected is expected. By the very nature of expecting, the possible is drawn into the actual, arising out of the actual, and returning to it. But being towards this possibility as being towards death is so to comport ourselves towards death that in this being and for it, death reveals itself as a possibility. Our terminology for such being towards this possibility is anticipation of this possibility. But in this way of behaving, does there not lurk a coming close to the possible, and when one is close to the possible, does not its actualization emerge? In this kind of coming close, however, one does not tend towards concernfully making available something actual. But as one comes closer understandingly, the possibility of the possible just becomes greater. The closest closeness which one may have in being towards death as a possibility is as far as possible from anything actual. The more unveiledly this possibility gets understood, the more purely does the understanding penetrate into it as the possibility of the impossibility of any existence at all. Death, as possibility, gives Dasein nothing to be actualized, nothing which Dasein, as actual, could itself be. It is the possibility of the impossibility of every way of comporting oneself towards anything, of every way of existing. In the anticipation of this possibility it becomes greater and greater. That is to say, the possibility reveals itself to be such that it knows no measure at all, no more or less, but signifies the possibility of the measureless impossibility of existence. In accordance with its essence, this possibility offers no support for becoming intent on something, picturing to oneself the actuality which is possible, and so forgetting its possibility. Being towards death as anticipation of possibility is what first makes this possibility possible, and sets it free as possibility. Being towards death is the anticipation of a potentiality for being of that entity, whose kind of being is anticipation itself. In the anticipatory revealing of this potentiality for being, Dasein discloses itself to itself as regards its uttermost possibility. But to project itself on its ownmost potentiality for being means to be able to understand itself in the being of the entity so revealed, namely, to exist. Anticipation turns out to be the possibility of understanding one's ownmost and uttermost potentiality for being. That is to say, the possibility of authentic existence. The ontological constitution of such existence must be made visible by setting forth the concrete structure of anticipation of death. How are we to delimit this structure phenomenally? Manifestly, we must do so by determining those characteristics which must belong to an anticipatory disclosure, so that it can become the pure understanding of that ownmost possibility which is non-relational and not to be outstripped, which is certain and as such indefinite. It must be noted that understanding does not primarily mean just gazing at a meaning, but rather understanding oneself in that potentiality for being which reveals itself in projection. Death is Dasein's ownmost possibility. Being towards this possibility discloses to Dasein its ownmost potentiality for being, in which its very being is the issue. Here it can become manifest to Dasein that in this distinctive possibility of its own self, it has been wrenched away from the they. This means that, in anticipation, any Dasein can have wrenched itself away from the they already. But when one understands that this is something which Dasein can have done, this only reveals its factical lostness in the everydayness of the they-self. The ownmost possibility is non-relational. Anticipation allows Dasein to understand that the potentiality for being, in which its ownmost being is an issue, must be taken over by Dasein alone. Death does not just belong to one's own Dasein in an undifferentiated way. Death lays claim to it as an individual Dasein. The non-relational character of death, as understood in anticipation, individualizes Dasein down to itself. This individualizing is a way in which the there is disclosed for existence. It makes manifest that all being alongside the things with which we concern ourselves, and all being with others, will fail us when our ownmost potentiality for being is the issue. Dasein can be authentically itself only if it makes this possible for itself of its own accord. But if concern and solicitude fail us, this does not signify at all that these ways of Dasein have been cut off from its authentically being its self. As structures essential to Dasein's constitution, these have a share in conditioning the possibility of any existence whatsoever. Dasein is authentically itself only to the extent that, as concernful being alongside, and solicitous being with, it projects itself upon its ownmost potentiality for being, rather than upon the possibility of the they-self. The entity which anticipates its non-relational possibility is thus forced by that very anticipation into the possibility of taking over from itself its ownmost being, and doing so of its own accord. The ownmost non-relational possibility is not to be outstripped. Being towards this possibility enables Dasein to understand that giving itself up impends for it as the uttermost possibility of its existence. Anticipation, however, unlike inauthentic being towards death, does not evade the fact that death is not to be outstripped. Instead, anticipation frees itself for accepting this. When, by anticipation, one becomes free for one's own death, one is liberated from one's lostness in those possibilities which may accidentally thrust themselves upon one. And one is liberated in such a way that for the first time one can authentically understand and choose among the factical possibilities lying ahead of that possibility which is not to be outstripped. Anticipation discloses to existence that its uttermost possibility lies in giving itself up, and thus it shatters all one's tenaciousness to whatever existence one has reached. In anticipation, Dasein guards itself against falling back behind itself, or behind the potentiality for being which it has understood. It guards itself against becoming too old for its victories, Nietzsche. Free for its ownmost possibilities, which are determined by the end, and so are understood as finite, endliche, Dasein dispels the danger that it may, by its own finite understanding of existence, fail to recognize that it is getting outstripped by the existence possibilities of others, or rather that it may explain these possibilities wrongly, and force them back upon its own, so that it may divest itself of its ownmost factical existence. As the non-relational possibility, death individualizes, but only in such a manner that, as the possibility which is not to be outstripped, it makes Dasein, as being with, have some understanding of the potentiality for being of others. Since anticipation of the possibility which is not to be outstripped discloses also all the possibilities which lie ahead of that possibility, this anticipation includes the possibility of taking the whole of Dasein in advance, vorwegnehmens, in an existentiell manner, that is to say, it includes the possibility of existing as a whole potentiality for being. The ownmost non-relational possibility, which is not to be outstripped, is certain. The way to be certain of it is determined by the kind of truth which corresponds to it, disclosedness. The certain possibility of death, however, discloses Dasein as a possibility, but does so only in such a way that, in anticipating this possibility, Dasein makes this possibility possible for itself, as its ownmost potentiality for being. The possibility is disclosed because it is made possible in anticipation. To maintain oneself in this truth, that is, to be certain of what has been disclosed, demands all the more that one should anticipate. We cannot compute the certainty of death by ascertaining how many cases of death we encounter. This certainty is by no means of the kind which maintains itself in the truth of the present at hand. When something present at hand has been uncovered, it is encountered most purely if we just look at the entity and let it be encountered in itself. Dasein must first have lost itself in the factual circumstances, Sachverhalte. This can be one of care's own tasks and possibilities, if it is to obtain the pure objectivity, that is to say, the indifference of apodictic evidence. If being certain in relation to death does not have this character, this does not mean that it is of a lower grade, but that it does not belong at all to the graded order of the kinds of evidence we can have about the present at hand. Holding death for true, death is just one's own, shows another kind of certainty, and is more primordial than any certainty which relates to entities encountered within the world, or to formal objects, for it is certain of being in the world. As such, holding death for true does not demand just one definite kind of behavior in Dasein, but demands Dasein itself in the full authenticity of its existence. In anticipation, Dasein can first make certain of its ownmost being in its totality, a totality which is not to be outstripped. Therefore, the evidential character which belongs to the immediate givenness of experiences, of the I, or of consciousness, must necessarily lag behind the certainty which anticipation includes. Yet this is not because the way in which these are grasped would not be a rigorous one, but because in principle such a way of grasping them cannot hold for true, disclosed, something which at bottom it insists upon having there as true, namely Dasein itself, which I myself am, and which, as a potentiality for being, I can be authentically only by anticipation. The ownmost possibility, which is non-relational, not to be outstripped, and certain, is indefinite as regards its certainty. How does anticipation disclose this characteristic of Dasein's distinctive possibility? How does the anticipatory understanding project itself upon a potentiality for being, which is certain, and which is constantly possible in such a way that the when, in which the utter impossibility of existence becomes possible, remains constantly indefinite? In anticipating, the indefinite certainty of death, Dasein opens itself to a constant threat arising out of its own there. In this very threat, being towards the end must maintain itself. So little can it tone this down that it must rather cultivate the indefiniteness of the certainty. How is it existentially possible for this constant threat to be genuinely disclosed? All understanding is accompanied by a state of mind. Dasein's mood brings it face to face with the thrownness of its that it is there. But the state of mind which can hold open the utter and constant threat to itself arising from Dasein's own most individualized being is anxiety. In this state of mind, Dasein finds itself face to face with the nothing, of the possible impossibility of its existence. Anxiety is anxious about the potentiality for being of the entity so destined, des so bestimmten Seienden, and in this way it discloses the uttermost possibility. Anticipation utterly individualizes Dasein and allows it, in this individualization of itself, to become certain of the totality of its potentiality for being. For this reason, anxiety, as a basic state of mind, belongs to such a self-understanding of Dasein on the basis of Dasein itself. Being towards death is essentially anxiety. This is attested unmistakably, though only indirectly, by being towards death, as we have described it, when it perverts anxiety into cowardly fear, and in surmounting this fear, only makes known its own cowardliness in the face of anxiety. We may now summarize our characterization of authentic being towards death as we have projected it existentially. Anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they-self, and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself, primarily unsupported by concernful solicitude, but of being itself rather in an impassioned freedom towards death, a freedom which has been released from the illusions of the they, and which is factical, certain of itself, and anxious. All the relationships which belong to being towards death up to the full content of Dasein's uttermost possibility, as we have characterized it, constitute an anticipation which they combine in revealing, unfolding, and holding fast as that which makes this possibility possible. The existential projection in which anticipation has been delimited has made visible the ontological possibility of an existentiel being towards death, which is authentic. Therewith, however, the possibility of Dasein's having an authentic potentiality for being a whole emerges, but only as an ontological possibility. In our existential projection of anticipation, we have, of course, clung to those structures of Dasein which we have arrived at earlier, and we have, as it were, let Dasein itself project itself upon this possibility, without holding up to Dasein an ideal of existence with any special content, or forcing any such ideal upon it from outside. Nevertheless, this existentially possible being towards death remains, from the existentiel point of view, a fantastical exaction. The fact that an authentic potentiality for being a whole is ontologically possible for Dasein signifies nothing, so long as a corresponding ontical potentiality for being has not been demonstrated in Dasein itself. Does Dasein ever factically throw itself into such a being towards death? Does Dasein demand, even by reason of its own most being, an authentic potentiality for being determined by anticipation? Before answering these questions, we must investigate whether, to any extent and in any way, Dasein gives testimony from its own most potentiality for being, as to a possible authenticity of its existence, so that it not only makes known that in an existentiel manner such authenticity is possible, but demands this of itself. The question of Dasein's authentic being a whole and of its existential constitution still hangs in mid-air. It can be put on a phenomenal basis which will stand the test only if it can cling to a possible authenticity of its being, which is attested by Dasein itself. If we succeed in uncovering that attestation phenomenologically, together with what it attests, then the problem will arise anew as to whether the anticipation of zum death, which we have hitherto projected only in its ontological possibility, has an essential connection with that authentic potentiality for being which has been attested. Chapter 2. Dasein's attestation of an authentic potentiality for being and resoluteness. Section 54. The problem of how an authentic existentiel possibility is attested. What we are seeking is an authentic potentiality for being of Dasein, which will be attested in its existentiel possibility by Dasein itself. But this very attestation must first be such that we can find it. If in this attestation Dasein itself, as something for which authentic existence is possible, is to be given to Dasein to understand, this attestation will have its roots in Dasein's being. So, in exhibiting it phenomenologically, we include a demonstration that in Dasein's state of being it has its source. In this attestation, an authentic potentiality for being oneself is to be given us to understand. The question of the who of Dasein has been answered with the expression self. Dasein's selfhood has been defined formally as a way of existing, and therefore not as an entity present at hand. For the most part, I myself am not the who of Dasein. The they self is its who. Authentic being oneself takes the definite form of an existentielle modification of the they, and this modification must be defined existentially. What does this modification imply, and what are the ontological conditions for its possibility? With Dasein's lostness in the they, that factical potentiality for being which is closest to it, the tasks, rules, and standards, the urgency and extent of concernful and solicitous being in the world, has already been decided upon. The they has always kept Dasein from taking hold of these possibilities of being. The they even hides the manner in which it has tacitly relieved Dasein of the burden of explicitly choosing these possibilities. It remains indefinite who has really done the choosing. So Dasein makes no choices, gets carried along by the nobody, and thus ensnares itself in inauthenticity. This process can be reversed only if Dasein specifically brings itself back to itself from its lostness in the they. But this bringing back must have that kind of being by the neglect of which Dasein has lost itself in inauthenticity. When Dasein thus brings itself back, das sich zurückholen from the they self is modified in an existentielle manner so that it becomes authentic, being oneself. This must be accomplished by making up for not choosing, nachholen eine Wahl. But making up for not choosing signifies choosing to make this choice, deciding for a potentiality for being, and making this decision from one's own self. In choosing to make this choice, Dasein makes possible, first and foremost, its authentic potentiality for being. But because Dasein is lost in the they, it must first find itself. In order to find itself at all, it must be shown to itself in its possible authenticity. In terms of its possibility, Dasein is already a potentiality for being itself, but it needs to have this potentiality attested. In the following interpretation, we shall claim that this potentiality is attested by that which, in Dasein's everyday interpretation of itself, is familiar to us as the voice of conscience, Stimme des Gewissens. That the very fact of conscience has been disputed, that its function as a higher court for Dasein's existence has been variously assessed, and that what conscience says has been interpreted in manifold ways, all this might only mislead us into dismissing this phenomenon if the very doubtfulness of this fact, or of the way in which it has been interpreted, did not prove that here a primordial phenomenon of Dasein lies before us. In the following analysis, conscience will be taken as something which we have in advance theoretically, and it will be investigated in a purely existential manner, with fundamental ontology as our aim. We shall first trace conscience back to its existential foundations and structures, and make it visible as a phenomenon of Dasein, holding fast to what we have hitherto arrived at as that entity's state of being. The ontological analysis of conscience on which we are thus embarking is prior to any description and classification of experiences of conscience, and likewise lies outside of any biological explanation of this phenomenon, which would mean its dissolution. But it is no less distant from a theological exegesis of conscience, or any employment of this phenomenon for proofs of God, or for establishing an immediate consciousness of God. Nevertheless, even when our investigation of conscience is thus restricted, we must neither exaggerate its outcome nor make perverse claims about it and lessen its worth. As a phenomenon of Dasein, conscience is not just a fact which occurs and is occasionally present at hand. It is only in Dasein's kind of being, and it makes itself known as a fact only with factical existence and in it. The demand that an inductive empirical proof should be given for the factuality of conscience, and for the legitimacy of its voice, rests upon an ontological perversion of the phenomenon. This perversion, however, is one that is shared by every superior criticism, in which conscience is taken as something just occurring from time to time, rather than as a universally established and ascertainable fact. Among such proofs and counterproofs, the fact of conscience cannot present itself at all. This is no lack in it, but merely a sign by which we can recognize it as ontologically of a different kind from what is environmentally present at hand. Conscience gives us something to understand. It discloses. By characterizing this phenomenon formally in this way, we find ourselves enjoined to take it back into the discloseness of Dasein. This discloseness, as a basic state of that entity which we ourselves are, is constituted by state of mind, understanding, falling, and discourse. If we analyze conscience more penetratingly, it is revealed as a call, Ruf. Calling is a mode of discourse. The call of conscience has the character of an appeal to Dasein by calling it to its ownmost potentiality for being itself, and this is done by way of summoning it to its ownmost being guilty. This existential interpretation is necessarily a far cry from everyday ontical common sense, though it sets forth the ontological foundations of what the ordinary way of interpreting conscience has always understood, within certain limits, and has conceptualized as a theory of conscience. Accordingly, our existential interpretation needs to be confirmed by a critique of the way in which conscience is ordinarily interpreted. When this phenomenon has been exhibited, we can bring out the extent to which it attests an authentic potentiality for being of Dasein. To the call of conscience there corresponds a possible hearing. Our understanding of the appeal unveils itself as our wanting to have a conscience. Gewissen haben wollen. But in this phenomenon lies that existentiell choosing which we seek, the choosing to choose a kind of being oneself, which, in accordance with its existential structure, we call resoluteness. Thus we can see how the analyses of this chapter are divided up. The existential ontological foundations of conscience, section 55, the character of conscience as a call, section 56, conscience as the call of care, section 57, understanding the appeal and guilt, section 58, the existential interpretation of conscience and the way conscience is ordinarily interpreted, section 59, the existential structure of the authentic potentiality for being which is attested in the conscience, section 60. Section 55. The existential ontological foundations of conscience. In the phenomenon of conscience we find, without further differentiation, that, in some way, it gives us something to understand. Our analysis of it takes its departure from this finding. Conscience discloses, and thus belongs, within the range of those existential phenomena which constitute the being of the there as discloseness. We have analyzed the most universal structures of state of mind, understanding, discourse, and falling. If we now bring conscience into this phenomenal context, this is not a matter of applying these structures schematically to a special case of Dasein's disclosure. On the contrary, our interpretation of conscience not only will carry further our earlier analysis of the discloseness of the there, but it will also grasp it more primordially with regard to Dasein's authentic being. Through discloseness, that entity which we call Dasein is in the possibility of being its there. With its world, it is there for itself, and indeed, proximally and for the most part, in such a way that it has disclosed to itself its potentiality for being in terms of the world, of its concern. Dasein exists as a potentiality for being which has, in each case, already abandoned itself to definite possibilities. And it has abandoned itself to these possibilities because it is an entity which has been thrown, and an entity whose thrownness gets disclosed more or less plainly and impressively by its having a mood. To any state of mind or mood, understanding belongs equi-primordially. In this way Dasein knows what it is itself capable of, woran es mit ihm selbst ist, inasmuch as it has either projected itself upon possibilities of its own, or has been so absorbed in the they, that it has let such possibilities be presented to it by the way in which the they has publicly interpreted things. The presenting of these possibilities, however, is made possible existentially through the fact that Dasein, as a being with which understands, can listen to others. Losing itself in the publicness and the idle talk of the they, it fails to hear, überhört, its own self, in listening to the they-self. If Dasein is to be able to get brought back from this lostness of failing to hear itself, and if this is to be done through itself, then it must first be able to find itself. To find itself as something which has failed to hear itself, and which fails to hear in that it listens away to the they. This listening away must get broken off. In other words, the possibility of another kind of hearing which will interrupt it must be given by Dasein itself. The possibility of it thus getting broken off lies in its being appealed to without mediation. Dasein fails to hear itself and listens away to the they. And this listening away gets broken by the call, if that call, in accordance with its character as such, arouses another kind of hearing, which, in relationship to the hearing that is lost, has a character in every way opposite. If in this lost hearing one has been fascinated with the hubbub of the manifold ambiguity, which idle talk possesses in its everyday newness, then the call must do its calling without any hubbub and unambiguously, leaving no foothold for curiosity. That which, by calling in this manner, gives us to understand, is the conscience. We take calling as a mode of discourse. Discourse articulates intelligibility. Characterizing conscience as a call is not just giving a picture, like the Kantian representation of the conscience, as a court of justice. Vocal utterance, however, is not essential for discourse, and therefore not for the call either. This must not be overlooked. Discourse is already presupposed in any expressing or proclaiming, ausrufen. If the everyday interpretation knows a voice of conscience, then one is not so much thinking of an utterance, for this is something which factically one never comes across. The voice is taken rather as a giving to understand. In the tendency to disclosure which belongs to the call lies the momentum of a push, of an abrupt arousal. The call is from afar unto afar. It reaches him who wants to be brought back. But by this characterization of the conscience we have only traced the phenomenal horizon for analyzing its existential structure. We are not comparing this phenomenon with a call. We are understanding it as a kind of discourse, in terms of the disclosedness that is constitutive for Dasein. In considering this, we have from the beginning avoided the first route which offers itself for an interpretation of conscience, that of tracing it back to some psychical faculty such as understanding, will or feeling, or of explaining it as some sort of mixture of these. When one is confronted with such a phenomenon as conscience, one is struck by the ontologico-anthropological inadequacy of a free-floating framework of psychical faculties or personal actions, all duly classified. Section 56. The character of conscience as a call. To any discourse there belongs that which is talked about in it. Discourse gives information about something, and does so in some definite regard. From what is thus talked about it draws whatever it is saying as this particular discourse, what is said in the talk as such. In discourse as communication, this becomes accessible to the Dasein with of others, for the most part by way of uttering it in language. In the call of conscience, what is it that is talked about? In other words, to what is the appeal made? Manifestly Dasein itself. This answer is as incontestable as it is indefinite. If the call has so vague a target, then it might at most remain an occasion for Dasein to pay attention to itself. But it is essential to Dasein that along with the disclosedness of its world, it has been disclosed to itself, so that it always understands itself. The call reaches Dasein in this understanding of itself which it always has, and which is concernful in an everyday average manner. The call reaches the they-self of concernful being with others. And to what is one called when one is thus appealed to? To one's own self, not to what Dasein counts for, can do, or concerns itself with, in being with one another publicly, nor to what it has taken hold of, set about, or let itself be carried along with. The sort of Dasein which is understood after the manner of the world, both for others and for itself, gets passed over in this appeal. This is something of which the call to the self takes not the slightest cognizance. And because only the self of the they-self gets appealed to and brought to hear, the they collapses. But the fact that the call passes over both the they and the manner in which Dasein has been publicly interpreted does not by any means signify that the they is not reached too. Precisely in passing over the they, keen as it is for public repute, the call pushes it into insignificance, Bedeutungslosigkeit. But the self, which the appeal has robbed of this lodgment and hiding place, gets brought to itself by the call. When the they-self is appealed to, it gets called to the self. But it does not get called to that self which can become for itself an object on which to pass judgment, nor to that self which inertly dissects its inner life with fussy curiosity, nor to that self which one has in mind when one gazes analytically at psychical conditions and what lies behind them. The appeal to the self in the they-self does not force it inwards upon itself, so that it can close itself off from the external world. The call passes over everything like this and disperses it, so as to appeal solely to that self which, notwithstanding, is in no other way than being in the world. But how are we to determine what is said in the talk that belongs to this kind of discourse? What does the conscience call to him to whom it appeals? Taken strictly, nothing. The call asserts nothing, gives no information about world events, has nothing to tell. Least of all does it try to set going a soliloquy in the self to which it has appealed. Nothing gets called to, zugerufen, this self, but it has been summoned, aufgerufen, to itself, that is, to its ownmost potentiality for being. The tendency of the call is not such as to put up for trial the self to which the appeal is made, but it calls Dasein forth and forward into its ownmost possibilities, as a summons to its ownmost potentiality for being itself. The call dispenses with any kind of utterance. It does not put itself into words at all, yet it remains nothing less than obscure and indefinite. Conscience discourses solely and constantly in the mode of keeping silent. In this way it not only loses none of its perceptibility, but forces the Dasein, which has been appealed to and summoned, into the reticence of itself. The fact that what is called in the call has not been formulated in words does not give this phenomenon the indefiniteness of a mysterious voice, but merely indicates that our understanding of what is called is not to be tied up with an expectation of anything like a communication. Yet what the call discloses is unequivocal, even though it may undergo a different interpretation in the individual Dasein, in accordance with its own possibilities of understanding. While the content of the call is seemingly indefinite, the direction it takes is a sure one and is not to be overlooked. The call does not require us to search gropingly for him to whom it appeals, nor does it require any sign by which we can recognize that he is or is not the one who is meant. When delusions arise in the conscience, they do so not because the call has committed some oversight, has miscalled, but only because the call gets heard in such a way that instead of becoming authentically understood, it gets drawn by the they-self into a soliloquy in which causes get pleaded, and it becomes perverted in its tendency to disclose. One must keep in mind that when we designate the conscience as a call, this call is an appeal to the they-self in itself. As such an appeal, it summons the self to its potentiality for being itself, and thus calls Dasein forth to its possibilities. But we shall not obtain an ontologically adequate interpretation of the conscience until it can be made plain not only who is called by the call, but also who does the calling, how the one to whom the appeal is made is related to the one who calls, and how this relationship must be taken ontologically as a way in which these are interconnected in their being. making. Section 57. Conscience as the call of care. Conscience summons Dasein's self from its lostness in the they. The self, to which the appeal is made, remains indefinite and empty in its what. When Dasein interprets itself in terms of that with which it concerns itself, the call passes over what Dasein, proximally and for the most part, understands itself as, and yet the self has been reached unequivocally and unmistakably. Not only is the call meant for him to whom the appeal is made, without regard for persons, but even the caller maintains itself in conspicuous indefiniteness. If the caller is asked about its name, status, origin, or repute, it not only refuses to answer, but does not even leave the slightest possibility of one's making it into something with which one can be familiar when one's understanding of Dasein has a worldly orientation. On the other hand, it by no means disguises itself in the call. That which calls, the call, simply holds itself aloof from any way of becoming well known, and this belongs to its phenomenal character. To let itself be drawn into getting considered and talked about goes against its kind of being. The peculiar indefiniteness of the caller and the impossibility of making more definite what this caller is are not just nothing. They are distinctive for it in a positive way. They make known to us that the caller is solely absorbed in summoning us to something, that it is heard only as such, and furthermore that it will not let itself be coaxed. But if so, is it not quite appropriate to the phenomenon to leave unasked the question of what the caller is? Yes, indeed. When it comes to listening to the factical call of conscience in an existentiel way, but not when it comes to analyzing existentially the facticity of the calling and the existentiality of the hearing. But is it at all necessary to keep raising explicitly the question of who does the calling? Is this not answered for Dasein just as unequivocally as the question of to whom the call makes its appeal? In conscience, Dasein calls itself. This understanding of the caller may be more or less awake in the factical hearing of the call. Ontologically, however, it is not enough to answer that Dasein is at the same time both the caller and the one to whom the appeal is made. When Dasein is appealed to, is it not there in a different way from that in which it does the calling? Shall we say that its ownmost potentiality for being itself functions as the caller? Indeed, the call is precisely something which we ourselves have neither planned nor prepared for, nor voluntarily performed. Nor have we ever done so. It calls against our expectations and even against our will. On the other hand, the call undoubtedly does not come from someone else who is with me in the world. The call comes from me, and yet from beyond me. These phenomenal findings are not to be explained away. After all, they have been taken as a starting point for explaining the voice of conscience as an alien power by which Dasein is dominated. If the interpretation continues in this direction, one supplies a possessor for the power thus posited, or one takes the power itself as a person who makes himself known, namely God. On the other hand, one may try to reject this explanation in which the caller is taken as an alien manifestation of such a power, and to explain away the conscience biologically at the same time. Both these explanations pass over the phenomenal findings too hastily. Such procedures are facilitated by the unexpressed but ontologically dogmatic guiding thesis that what is, in other words, anything so factual as the call, must be present at hand, and that what does not let itself be objectively demonstrated as present at hand just is not at all. But methodologically this is too precipitate. We must indeed hold fast not only to the phenomenal finding that I receive the call as coming both from me and from beyond me, but also to the implication that this phenomenon is here delineated ontologically as a phenomenon of Dasein. Only the existential constitution of this entity can afford us a clue for interpreting the kind of being of the it which does the calling. Does our previous analysis of Dasein's state of being show us a way of making ontologically intelligible the kind of being which belongs to the caller, and along with it, that which belongs to the calling, the fact that the call is not something which is explicitly performed by me, but that rather it does the calling, does not justify seeking the caller in some entity with a character other than that of Dasein. Yet every Dasein always exists factically. It is not a free-floating self-projection, but its character is determined by thrownness, as a fact of the entity which it is. And as so determined, it has in each case already been delivered over to existence, and it constantly so remains. Dasein's facticity, however, is essentially distinct from the factuality of something present at hand. Existent Dasein does not encounter itself as something present at hand within the world, but neither does thrownness adhere to Dasein as an inaccessible characteristic which is of no importance for its existence. As something thrown, Dasein has been thrown into existence. It exists as an entity which has to be as it is and as it can be. That it is factically may be obscure and hidden as regards the why of it, but that it is has itself been disclosed to Dasein. The thrownness of this entity belongs to the disclosedness of the there and reveals itself constantly in its current state of mind. This state of mind brings Dasein more or less explicitly and authentically face to face with the fact that it is, and that it has to be something with the potentiality for being as the entity which it is. For the most part, however, its mood is such that its thrownness gets closed off. In the face of its thrownness, Dasein flees to the relief which comes with the supposed freedom of the they-self. This fleeing has been described as a fleeing in the face of the uncanniness which is basically determinative for individualized being in the world. Uncanniness reveals itself authentically in the basic state of mind of anxiety, and as the most elemental way in which thrown Dasein is disclosed, it puts Dasein's being in the world face to face with the nothing of the world. In the face of this nothing, Dasein is anxious with anxiety about its ownmost potentiality for being. What if this Dasein, which finds itself, sich befindet, in the very depths of its uncanniness, should be the caller of the call of conscience? Nothing speaks against this, but all those phenomena which we have hitherto set forth in characterizing the caller and its calling speak for it. In its who, the caller is definable in a worldly way by nothing at all. The caller is Dasein in its uncanniness, primordial, thrown being in the world, as the not at home, the bare that it is in the nothing of the world. The caller is unfamiliar to the everyday they-self. It is something like an alien voice. What could be more alien to the they, lost in the manifold world of its concern, than the self which has been individualized down to itself in uncanniness, and been thrown into the nothing? It calls, even though it gives the concernfully curious ear nothing to hear, which might be passed along in further retelling and talked about in public. But what is Dasein even to report from the uncanniness of its thrown being? What else remains for it than its own potentiality for being as revealed in anxiety? How else is it to call than by summoning Dasein towards this potentiality for being, which alone is the issue? The call does not report events. It calls without uttering anything. The call discourses in the uncanny mode of keeping silent, and it does this only because in calling the one to whom the appeal is made, it does not call him into the public idle talk of the they, but calls him back from this into the reticence of his existent potentiality for being. When the caller reaches him to whom the appeal is made, it does so with a cold assurance which is uncanny but by no means obvious. Wherein lies the basis for this assurance, if not in the fact that when Dasein has been individualized down to itself in its uncanniness, it is for itself something that simply cannot be mistaken for anything else? What is it that so radically deprives Dasein of the possibility of misunderstanding itself by any sort of alibi and failing to recognize itself, if not the forsakenness, Verlassenheit, with which it has been abandoned, Überlassenheit to itself? Uncanniness is the basic kind of being in the world, even though in an everyday way it has been covered up. Out of the depths of this kind of being, Dasein itself, as conscience, calls. The "it calls me," es ruft mich, is a distinctive kind of discourse for Dasein. The call, whose mood has been attuned by anxiety, is what makes it possible, first and foremost, for Dasein to project itself upon its ownmost potentiality for being. The call of conscience, existentially understood, makes known for the first time what we have hitherto merely contended. That uncanniness pursues Dasein, and is a threat to the lostness in which it has forgotten itself. The proposition that Dasein is at the same time both the caller and the one to whom the appeal is made has now lost its empty formal character and its obviousness. Conscience manifests itself as the call of care. The caller is Dasein, which in its thrownness, in its being already in, is anxious about its potentiality for being. The one to whom the appeal is made is this very same Dasein. Summoned to its ownmost potentiality for being, ahead of itself, Dasein is falling into the they, in being already alongside the world of its concern, and it is summoned out of this falling by the appeal. The call of conscience, that is, conscience itself, has its ontological possibility in the fact that Dasein, in the very basis of its being, is care. So we need not resort to powers with a character other than that of Dasein. Indeed, recourse to these is so far from clarifying the uncanniness of the call that instead it annihilates it. In the end, does not the reason why explanations of the conscience have gone off the track lie in the fact that we have not looked long enough to establish our phenomenal findings as to the call, and that Dasein has been presupposed as having some kind of ontological definiteness, or indefiniteness, whichever it may chance? Why should we look to alien powers for information before we have made sure that in starting our analysis we have not given too low an assessment of Dasein's being, regarding it as an innocuous subject endowed with personal consciousness, somehow or other occurring? And yet, if the caller, who is nobody when seen after the manner of the world, is interpreted as a power, this seems to be a dispassionate recognition of something that one can come across objectively. When seen correctly, however, this interpretation is only a fleeing in the face of the conscience, a way for Dasein to escape by slinking away from that thin wall by which the they is separated, as it were, from the uncanniness of its being. This interpretation of the conscience passes itself off as recognizing the call in the sense of a voice, which is universally binding and which speaks in a way that is not just subjective. Furthermore, the universal conscience becomes exalted to a world conscience, which still has the phenomenal character of an it and nobody, yet which speaks, there in the individual subject, as this indefinite something. But this public conscience, what else is it than the voice of the they? A world conscience is a dubious fabrication, and Dasein can come to this only because conscience, in its basis and in its essence, is in each case mine, not only in the sense that in each case the appeal is to one's ownmost potentiality for being, but because the call comes from that entity which in each case I myself am. With this interpretation of the caller, which is purely in accord with the phenomenal character of the calling, the power of conscience is not diminished and rendered merely subjective. On the contrary, only in this way do the inexorability and unequivocal character of the call become free. This interpretation does justice to the objectivity of the appeal for the first time, by leaving it its subjectivity, which of course denies the they-self its dominion. Nevertheless, this interpretation of the conscience as the call of care will be countered by the question of whether any interpretation of the conscience can stand up if it removes itself so far from natural experience. How is the conscience to function as that which summons us to our ownmost potentiality for being, when proximally and for the most part it merely warns and reproves? Does the conscience speak in so indefinite and empty a manner about our potentiality for being? Does it not rather speak definitely and concretely in relation to failures and omissions which have already befallen, or which we still have before us? Does the alleged appeal stem from a bad conscience or from a good one? Does the conscience give us anything positive at all? Does it not function rather in just a critical fashion? Such considerations are indisputably within their rights. We can, however, demand that in any interpretation of conscience one should recognize in it the phenomenon in question, as it is experienced in an everyday manner. But satisfying this requirement does not mean in turn that the ordinary ontical way of understanding conscience must be recognized as the first court of appeal, erste Instanz, for an ontological interpretation. On the other hand, the considerations which we have just marshalled remain premature as long as the analysis of conscience to which they pertain falls short of its goal. Hitherto we have merely tried to trace back conscience as a phenomenon of Dasein to the ontological constitution of that entity. This has served to prepare us for the task of making the conscience intelligible as an attestation of Dasein's ownmost potentiality for being, an attestation which lies in Dasein itself. But what the conscience attests becomes completely definite only when we have delimited, plainly enough, the character of the hearing which genuinely corresponds to the calling. The authentic understanding which follows the call is not a mere addition which attaches itself to the phenomenon of conscience by a process which may or may not be forthcoming. Only from an understanding of the appeal, and together with such an understanding, does the full experience of conscience let itself be grasped. If in each case the caller and he to whom the appeal is made are at the same time one's own Dasein themselves, then in any failure to hear the call or any incorrect hearing of oneself, there lies a definite kind of Dasein's being. A free-floating call from which nothing ensues is an impossible fiction when seen existentially. With regard to Dasein, that nothing ensues signifies something positive. So then only by analyzing the way the appeal is understood can one be led to discuss explicitly what the call gives one to understand. But only with our foregoing general ontological characterization of the conscience does it become possible to conceive existentially the conscience call of guilty. All experiences and interpretations of the conscience are at one, in that they make the voice of conscience speak somehow of guilt. Section 58. Understanding the appeal and guilt. To grasp phenomenally what one hears in understanding the appeal, we must go back to the appeal anew. The appeal to the they-self signifies summoning one's ownmost self to its potentiality for being, and of course as Dasein. That is, as concernful being in the world and being with others. Thus, in interpreting existentially that towards which the call summons us, we cannot seek to delimit any concrete single possibility of existence, as long as we correctly understand the methodological possibilities and tasks which such an interpretation implies. That which can be established and which seeks to be established is not what gets called in and to each particular Dasein from an existentiel standpoint, but is rather what belongs to the existential condition for the possibility of its factical existentiel potentiality for being. When the call is understood with an existentiel kind of hearing, such understanding is more authentic. The more non-relationally Dasein hears and understands its own being appealed to. And the less the meaning of the call gets perverted by what one says, or by what is fitting and accepted, was sich gehört und gilt. But what is it that is essentially implied when the appeal is understood authentically? What is it that has been essentially given to us to understand in the call at any particular time, even if factically it has not always been understood? We have already answered this question, however, in our thesis that the call says nothing which might be talked about, gives no information about events. The call points forward to Dasein's potentiality for being, and it does this as a call which comes from uncanniness. The caller is, to be sure, indefinite, but the whence from which it calls does not remain a matter of indifference for the calling. This whence, the uncanniness of thrown individualization, gets called to, mitgerufen, in the calling. That is, it too gets disclosed, mit erschlossen. In calling forth to something, the whence of the calling is the whither to which we are called back. When the call gives us a potentiality for being to understand, it does not give us one which is ideal and universal. It discloses it as that which has been currently individualized, and which belongs to that particular Dasein. We have not fully determined the character of the call as disclosure until we understand it as one which calls us back in calling us forth, als vorrufender Rückruf. If we take the call this way and orient ourselves by it, we must first ask what it gives us to understand. But is not the question of what the call says answered more easily and surely if we simply allude to what we generally hear, or fail to hear in any experience of conscience, namely, that the caller either addresses Dasein as guilty, or, as in the case when the conscience gives warning, refers to a possible guilty, or affirms, as a good conscience, that one is conscious of no guilt. Whatever the ways in which conscience is experienced or interpreted, all our experiences agree on this guilty, if only it were not defined in such wholly different ways. And even if the meaning of this guilty should let itself be taken in a way upon which everyone is agreed, the existential conception of this being guilty would still remain obscure. Yet if Dasein addresses itself as guilty, whence could it draw its idea of guilt except from the interpretation of its own being? All the same, the question arises anew, who says how we are guilty and what guilt signifies? On the other hand, the idea of guilt is not one which could be thought up arbitrarily and forced upon Dasein. If any understanding of the essence of guilt is possible at all, then this possibility must have been sketched out in Dasein beforehand. How are we to find the trail which can lead to revealing this phenomenon? All ontological investigations of such phenomena as guilt, conscience, and death must start with what the everyday interpretation of Dasein says about them. Because Dasein has falling as its kind of being, the way Dasein gets interpreted is for the most part inauthentically oriented, and does not reach the essence. For to Dasein, the primordially appropriate ontological way of formulating questions remains alien. But whenever we see something wrongly, some injunction as to the primordial idea of the phenomenon is revealed along with it. Where, however, shall we get our criterion for the primordial existential meaning of the guilty? From the fact that this guilty turns up as a predicate for the I am. Is it possible that what is understood as guilt in our inauthentic interpretation lies in Dasein's being as such, and that it does so in such a way that so far as any Dasein factically exists, it is also guilty? Thus, by invoking the guilty which everyone agrees that he hears, one has not yet answered the question of the existential meaning of what has been called in the call. What has been called must first be conceptualized if we are to understand what the call of guilty means, and why and how it becomes perverted in its signification by the everyday way of interpreting it. Everyday common sense first takes being guilty in the sense of owing, of having something due on account. One is to give back to the other something to which the latter has a claim. This being guilty as having debts, Schulden haben, is a way of being with others in the field of concern, as in providing something or bringing it along. Other modes of such concern are depriving, borrowing, withholding, taking, stealing, failing to satisfy in some way or other the claims which others have made as to their possessions. This kind of being guilty is related to that with which one can concern oneself. Being guilty also has the signification of being responsible for, Schuld sein an, that is, being the cause or author of something. or even being the occasion for something. In this sense of having responsibility for something, one can be guilty of something without owing anything to someone else or coming to owe him. On the other hand, one can owe something to another without being responsible for it oneself. Another person can incur debts with others for me. These ordinary significations of being guilty, as having debts to someone and having responsibility for something, can go together and define a kind of behavior which we call making oneself responsible. That is, by having the responsibility for having a debt, one may break a law and make oneself punishable. Yet the requirement which one fails to satisfy need not necessarily be related to anyone's possessions. It can regulate the very manner in which we are with one another publicly. Making oneself responsible by breaking a law, as we have thus defined it, can indeed also have the character of coming to owe something to others. This does not happen merely through law-breaking as such, but rather through my having the responsibility for the others becoming endangered in his existence, led astray or even ruined. This way of coming to owe something to others is possible without breaking the public law. Thus the formal conception of being guilty, in the sense of having come to owe something to another, may be defined as follows: being the basis for a lack of something in the Dasein of another, and in such a manner that this very being the basis determines itself as lacking in some way in terms of that for which it is the basis. This kind of lacking is a failure to satisfy some requirement which applies to one's existent being with others. We need not consider how such requirements arise, and in what way their character as requirements and laws must be conceived by reason of their having such a source. In any case, being guilty, in the sense last mentioned, the breach of a moral requirement, is a kind of being which belongs to Dasein. Of course, this holds good also for being guilty, as making oneself punishable, and as having debts, and for any having responsibility for. These too are ways in which Dasein behaves. If one takes laden with moral guilt as a quality of Dasein, one has said very little. On the contrary, this only makes it manifest that such a characterization does not suffice for distinguishing ontologically between this kind of attribute of being for Dasein and those other ways of behaving which we have just listed. After all, the concept of moral guilt has been so little clarified ontologically that when the idea of deserving punishment, or even of having debts to someone, has also been included in this concept, or when these ideas have been employed in the very defining of it, such interpretations of this phenomenon could become prevalent, and have remained so. But therewith the guilty gets thrust aside into the domain of concern, in the sense of reckoning up claims and balancing them off. The phenomenon of guilt, which is not necessarily related to having debts and law-breaking, can be clarified only if we first inquire in principle into Dasein's being guilty. In other words, if we conceive the idea of guilty in terms of Dasein's kind of being. If this is our goal, the idea of guilty must be sufficiently formalized so that those ordinary phenomena of guilt which are related to our concernful being with others will drop out. The idea of guilt must not only be raised above the domain of that concern in which we reckon things up, but it must also be detached from relationship to any law or ought, such that by failing to comply with it one loads himself with guilt. For here, too, guilt is still necessarily defined as a lack, when something which ought to be and which can be is missing. To be missing, however, means not being present at hand. A lack, as the not being present at hand of something which ought to be, is a definite sort of being which goes with the present at hand. In this sense, it is essential that in existence there can be nothing lacking, not because it would then be perfect, but because its character of being remains distinct from any presence at hand. Nevertheless, in the idea of guilty there lies the character of the not. If the guilty is something that can definitely apply to existence, then this raises the ontological problem of clarifying existentially the character of this not as a not. Moreover, to the idea of guilty belongs what is expressed without further differentiation in the conception of guilt as having responsibility for, that is, as being the basis for. Hence we define the formally existential idea of the guilty as being the basis for a being which has been defined by a not, that is to say, as being the basis of a nullity. The idea of the not, which lies in the concept of guilt as understood existentially, excludes relatedness to anything present at hand which is possible or which may have been required. Furthermore, Dasein is altogether incommensurable with anything present at hand or generally accepted, geltenden, which is not it itself, or which is not in the way Dasein is, namely existing. So any possibility that, with regard to being the basis for a lack, the entity which is itself such a basis might be reckoned up as lacking in some manner, is a possibility which drops out. If a lack, such as failure to fulfill some requirement, has been caused in a manner characteristic of Dasein, we cannot simply reckon back to there being something lacking, Mangelhaftigkeit, in the cause. Being the basis for something need not have the same not character as the privativum, which is based upon it and which arises from it. The basis need not acquire a nullity of its own from that for which it is the basis, seinem Begründeten. This implies, however, that being guilty does not first result from an indebtedness, Verschuldung, but that, on the contrary, indebtedness becomes possible only on the basis of a primordial being guilty. Can something like this be exhibited in Dasein's being, and how is it at all possible, existentially? Dasein's being is care. It comprises in itself facticity, thrownness, existence, projection, and falling. As being, Dasein is something that has been thrown. It has been brought into its there, but not of its own accord. As being, it has taken the definite form of a potentiality for being which has heard itself and has devoted itself to itself, but not as itself. As existent, it never comes back behind its thrownness in such a way that it might first release this, that it is and has to be, from its being itself, and lead it into the there. Thrownness, however, does not lie behind it as some event which has happened to Dasein, which has factually befallen and fallen loose from Dasein again. On the contrary, as long as Dasein is, Dasein, as care, is constantly its that it is. To this entity it has been delivered over, and as such it can exist solely as the entity which it is. And as this entity to which it has been thus delivered over, it is, in its existing, the basis of its potentiality for being. Although it has not laid that basis itself, it reposes in the weight of it, which is made manifest to it as a burden by Dasein's mood. And how is Dasein this thrown basis? Only in that it projects itself upon possibilities into which it has been thrown. The self, which as such has to lay the basis for itself, can never get that basis into its power, and yet, as existing, it must take over being a basis. To be its own thrown basis is that potentiality for being which is the issue for care. In being a basis, that is, in existing as thrown, Dasein constantly lags behind its possibilities. It is never existent before its basis, but only from it and as this basis. Thus, being a basis means never to have power over one's ownmost being from the ground up. This not belongs to the existential meaning of thrownness. It itself, being a basis, is a nullity of itself. Nullity does not signify anything like not being present at hand or not subsisting. What one has in view here is rather a not which is constitutive for this being of Dasein, its thrownness. The character of this not as a not may be defined existentially. In being itself, Dasein is, as a self, the entity that has been thrown. It has been released from its basis, not through itself but to itself, so as to be as this basis. Dasein is not itself the basis of its being, inasmuch as this basis first arises from its own projection. Rather, as being itself, it is the being of its basis. This basis is never anything but the basis for an entity whose being has to take over being a basis. Dasein is its basis existently, that is, in such a manner that it understands itself in terms of possibilities, and, as so understanding itself, is that entity which has been thrown. But this implies that in having a potentiality for being, it always stands in one possibility or another. It constantly is not other possibilities, and it has waived these in its existentielle projection. Not only is the projection, as one that has been thrown, determined by the nullity of being a basis. As projection, it is itself essentially null. This does not mean that it has the ontical property of inconsequentiality or worthlessness. What we have here is rather something existentially constitutive for the structure of the being of projection. The nullity we have in mind belongs to Dasein's being free for its existentielle possibilities. Freedom, however, is only in the choice of one possibility, that is, in tolerating one's not having chosen the others, and one's not being able to choose them. In the structure of thrownness, as in that of projection, there lies essentially a nullity. This nullity is the basis for the possibility of inauthentic Dasein in its falling, and as falling, every inauthentic Dasein factically is. Care itself, in its very essence, is permeated with nullity through and through. Thus, care, Dasein's being, means, as thrown projection, being the basis of a nullity, and this being the basis is itself null. This means that Dasein, as such, is guilty, if our formerly existential definition of guilt as being the basis of a nullity is indeed correct. Existential nullity has by no means the character of a privation, where something is lacking in comparison with an ideal which has been set up but does not get attained in Dasein. Rather, the being of this entity is already null as projection, and it is null in advance of, for, any of the things which it can project and which it mostly attains. This nullity, moreover, is thus not something which emerges in Dasein occasionally, attaching itself to it as an obscure quality which Dasein might eliminate if it made sufficient progress. In spite of this, the ontological meaning of the notness, Nichtheit, of this existential nullity is still obscure. But this holds also for the ontological essence of the not in general. Ontology and logic, to be sure, have exacted a great deal from the not, and have thus made its possibilities visible in a piecemeal fashion. But it itself has not been unveiled ontologically. Ontology came across the not and made use of it. But is it so obvious that every not signifies something negative in the sense of a lack? Is its positivity exhausted by the fact that it constitutes passing over something? Why does all dialectic take refuge in negation, though it cannot provide dialectical grounds for this sort of thing itself, or even just establish it as a problem? Has anyone ever made a problem of the ontological source of notness? Or, prior to that, even sought the mere conditions on the basis of which the problem of the not and its notness and the possibility of that notness can be raised? And how else are these conditions to be found except by taking the meaning of being in general as a theme and clarifying it? The concepts of privation and lack, which moreover are not very transparent, are already insufficient for the ontological interpretation of the phenomenon of guilt, though if we take them formally enough, we can put them to considerable use. Least of all can we come any closer to the existential phenomenon of guilt by taking our orientation from the idea of evil, the malum as privatio boni. Just as the bonum and its privatio have the same ontological origin in the ontology of the present at hand, this ontology also applies to the idea of value, which has been abstracted from these. Not only can entities whose being is care load themselves with factical guilt, but they are guilty in the very basis of their being. and this being guilty is what provides, above all, the ontological condition for Dasein's ability to come to owe anything in factically existing. This essential being guilty is, equiprimordially, the existential condition for the possibility of the morally good and for that of the morally evil, that is, for morality in general, and for the possible forms which this may take factically. The primordial being guilty cannot be defined by morality, since morality already presupposes it for itself. But what kind of experience speaks for this primordial being guilty which belongs to Dasein? Nor may we forget the counter-question, is guilt there only if a consciousness of guilt gets awakened? Or does not the primordial being guilty make itself known rather in the very fact that guilt is asleep? That this primordial being guilty remains proximally and for the most part undisclosed, that it is kept closed off by Dasein's falling being, reveals only the aforesaid nullity. Being guilty is more primordial than any knowledge about it. And only because Dasein is guilty in the basis of its being, and closes itself off from itself as something thrown and falling, is conscience possible, if indeed the call gives us this being guilty as something which at bottom we are to understand. The call is the call of care. Being guilty constitutes the being to which we give the name of care. In uncanniness, Dasein stands together with itself, primordially. Uncanniness brings this entity face to face with its undisguised nullity, which belongs to the possibility of its ownmost potentiality for being. To the extent that for Dasein, as care, its being is an issue, it summons itself as a they which is factically falling, and summons itself from its uncanniness towards its potentiality for being. The appeal calls back by calling forth. It calls Dasein forth to the possibility of taking over, in existing, even that thrown entity which it is. It calls Dasein back to its thrownness so as to understand this thrownness as the null basis which it has to take up into existence. This calling back, in which conscience calls forth, gives Dasein to understand that Dasein itself, the null basis for its null projection, standing in the possibility of its being, is to bring itself back to itself from its lostness in the they, and this means that it is guilty. But in that case, the sort of thing which Dasein gives itself to understand would be information about itself, and the hearing which corresponds to such a call would be a taking cognizance of the fact that one is guilty. If, however, the call is to have the character of a summons, does not this way of interpreting the conscience lead to a complete perversion of its function? Does not a summons to being guilty mean a summons to evil? One would not want to impose upon the conscience such a meaning for the call, even in the most violent of interpretations. But if not, what does it mean to summon one to being guilty? The meaning of the call becomes plain if, in our understanding of it, we stick to the existential sense of being guilty, instead of making basic the derivative conception of guilt in the sense of an indebtedness, which has arisen through some deed done or left undone. Such a demand is not arbitrary, if the call of conscience, coming from Dasein itself, is directed towards that entity alone. But if so, the summons to being guilty signifies a calling forth to that potentiality for being, which in each case I, as Dasein, am already. Dasein need not first load a guilt upon itself through its failures or omissions. It must only be guilty authentically, guilty in the way in which it is. Hearing the appeal correctly is thus tantamount to having an understanding of oneself in one's ownmost potentiality for being. That is, to projecting oneself upon one's own most authentic potentiality for becoming guilty. When Dasein understandingly lets itself be called forth to this possibility, this includes its becoming free for the call, its readiness for the potentiality of getting appealed to. In understanding the call, Dasein is in thrall to, hörig, its ownmost possibility of existence. It has chosen itself. In so choosing, Dasein makes possible its ownmost being guilty, which remains closed off from the they self. The common sense of the they knows only the satisfying of manipulable rules and public norms, and the failure to satisfy them. It reckons up infractions of them and tries to balance them off. It has slunk away from its ownmost being guilty so as to be able to talk more loudly about making mistakes. But in the appeal, the they self gets called to, angerufen, the ownmost being guilty of the self. Understanding the call is choosing, but it is not a choosing of conscience, which, as such, cannot be chosen. What is chosen is having a conscience, as being free for one's ownmost being guilty. Understanding the appeal means wanting to have a conscience. This does not mean that one wants to have a good conscience, still less that one cultivates the call voluntarily. It means solely that one is ready to be appealed to. Wanting to have a conscience is just as far from seeking out one's factical indebtedness as it is from the tendency to liberation from guilt in the sense of the essential guilty. Wanting to have a conscience is rather the most primordial existentielle presupposition for the possibility of factically coming to owe something. In understanding the call, Dasein lets its ownmost self take action in itself, in sich handeln, in terms of that potentiality for being which it has chosen. Only so can it be answerable, verantwortlich. Factically, however, any taking action is necessarily conscienceless, not only because it may fail to avoid some factical moral indebtedness, but because on the null basis of its null projection, it has, in being with others, already become guilty towards them. Thus one's wanting to have a conscience becomes the taking over of that essential consciencelessness, within which alone the existentielle possibility of being good subsists. Though the call gives no information, it is not merely critical. It is positive, in that it discloses Dasein's most primordial potentiality for being as being guilty. Thus conscience manifests itself as an attestation which belongs to Dasein's being, an attestation in which conscience calls Dasein itself face to face with its ownmost potentiality for being. Is there an existentially more concrete way of determining the character of authentic potentiality for being which has thus been attested? But now that we have exhibited a potentiality for being which is attested in Dasein itself, a preliminary question arises. Can we claim sufficient evidential weight for the way we have exhibited this, as long as the embarrassment of our interpreting the conscience in a one-sided manner by tracing it back to Dasein's constitution, while hastily passing over all the familiar findings of the ordinary interpretation of conscience, is one that is still undiminished? Is, then, the phenomenon of conscience, as it actually is, still recognizable at all in the interpretation we have given? Have we not been all too sure of ourselves in the ingenuousness with which we have deduced an idea of the conscience from Dasein's state of being? The final step of our interpretation of the conscience is the existential delimitation of the authentic potentiality for being, which conscience attests. If we are to assure ourselves of a way of access which will make such a step possible, even for the ordinary understanding of the conscience, we must explicitly demonstrate the connection between the results of our ontological analysis and the everyday ways in which the conscience is experienced. Is experienced. Is experienced. Is experienced. Section 59. The existential interpretation of the conscience, and the way conscience is ordinarily interpreted. Conscience is the call of care from the uncanniness of being in the world, the call which summons Dasein to its ownmost potentiality for being guilty, and corresponding to this call, wanting to have a conscience, has emerged as the way in which the appeal is understood. These two definitions cannot be brought into harmony at once with the ordinary interpretation of conscience. Indeed, they seem to be in direct conflict with it. We call this interpretation of conscience the ordinary one, vulgaire, because in characterizing this phenomenon and describing its function, it sticks to what they know as the conscience, and how they follow it or fail to follow it. But must the ontological interpretation agree with the ordinary interpretation at all? Should not the latter be, in principle, ontologically suspect? If indeed Dasein understands itself proximally and for the most part in terms of that with which it concerns itself, and if it interprets all its ways of behaving as concern, then will there not be falling and concealment in its interpretation of that very way of its being which, as a call, seeks to bring it back from its lostness in the concerns of the they? Everydayness takes Dasein as something ready to hand, to be concerned with. That is, something that gets managed and reckoned up. Life is a business, whether or not it covers its costs. And so, with regard to the ordinary kind of being of Dasein itself, there is no guarantee that the way of interpreting conscience which springs from it, or the theories of conscience which are thus oriented, have arrived at the right ontological horizon for its interpretation. In spite of this, even the ordinary experience of conscience must somehow, pre-ontologically, reach this phenomenon. Two things follow from this. On the one hand, the everyday way of interpreting conscience cannot be accepted as the final criterion for the objectivity of an ontological analysis. On the other hand, such an analysis has no right to disregard the everyday understanding of conscience, and to pass over the anthropological, psychological, and theological theories of conscience which have been based upon it. If existential analysis has laid bare the phenomenon of conscience in its ontological roots, then precisely in terms of this analysis the ordinary interpretations must become intelligible, and they must become intelligible not least in the ways in which they miss the phenomenon and in the reasons why they conceal it. But since, in the context of the problems of this treatise, the analysis of conscience is merely ancillary to what is ontologically the fundamental question, we must be satisfied with alluding to the essential problems when we characterize the connection between the existential interpretation of conscience and the way it is ordinarily interpreted. In this ordinary interpretation there are four objections which might be brought up against our interpretation of conscience as the summons of care to being guilty. 1. That the function of conscience is essentially critical. 2. That conscience always speaks in a way that is relative to some definite deed which has been performed or willed. 3. That when the voice is experienced, it is never so radically related to Dasein's being. 4. That our interpretation takes no account of the basic forms of the phenomenon evil, conscience, and good, that which reproves and that which warns. Let us begin our discussion with the last of these considerations. In all interpretations of conscience, the evil or bad conscience gets the priority. Conscience is primarily evil. Such a conscience makes known to us that in every experience of conscience something like a guilty gets experienced first. But in the idea of bad conscience, how is this making known of being evil understood? The experience of conscience turns up after the deed has been done or left undone. The voice follows the transgression and points back to that event which has befallen, and by which Dasein has loaded itself with guilt. If conscience makes known a being guilty, then it cannot do this by summoning us to something, but it does so by remembering the guilt which has been incurred, and referring to it. But does the fact that the voice comes afterwards prevent the call from being basically a calling forth? That the voice gets taken as a stirring of conscience which follows after is not enough to prove that we understand the phenomenon of conscience primordially. What if factical indebtedness were only the occasion for the factical calling of conscience? What if that interpretation of the evil conscience, which we have described, goes only halfway? That such is the case is evident from the ontological forehaving within whose scope the phenomenon has been brought by this interpretation. The voice is something that turns up. It has its position in the sequence of experiences which are present at hand, and it follows after the experience of the deed. But neither the call, nor the deed which has happened, nor the guilt with which one is laden, is an occurrence with the character of something present at hand which runs its course. The call has the kind of being which belongs to care. In the call, Dasein is ahead of itself in such a way that at the same time it directs itself back to its thrownness. Only by first positing that Dasein is an interconnected sequence of successive experiences is it possible to take the voice as something which comes afterwards, something later, which therefore necessarily refers back. The voice does call back, but it calls beyond the deed which has happened, and back to the being guilty into which one has been thrown, which is earlier than any indebtedness. But at the same time, this calling back calls forth to being guilty, as something to be seized upon in one's own existence, so that authentic existentiel, being guilty, only follows after the call, not vice versa. Bad conscience is basically so far from just reproving and pointing back that it rather points forward as it calls one back into one's thrownness. The order of the sequence in which experiences run their course does not give us the phenomenal structure of existing. If we cannot reach the primordial phenomenon by a characterization of bad conscience, still less can we do so by a characterization of good conscience, whether we take this as a self-subsistent form of conscience or as one which is essentially founded upon bad conscience. Just as Dasein's being evil would be made known to us in the bad conscience, the good conscience must have made known its being good. It is easy to see that the conscience, which used to be an effluence of the divine power, now becomes a slave of Pharisaism. Such a conscience would let a man say, "Of himself I am good." Who else can say this than the good man himself? And who would be less willing to affirm it? But if this impossible conclusion is drawn from the idea of the good conscience, the fact that being guilty is what the conscience calls only comes to the fore. To escape this conclusion, the good conscience has been interpreted as a privation of the bad one, and defined as an experienced lack of bad conscience. This would make it an experience of not having the call turn up, that is, of my having nothing with which to reproach myself. But how is such a lack experienced? This supposed experience is by no means the experiencing of a call. It is rather a making certain that a deed attributed to Dasein has not been perpetrated by it, and that Dasein is therefore not guilty. Becoming certain that one has not done something has by no means the character of a conscience phenomenon. It can, however, signify rather that one is forgetting one's conscience. In other words, that one is emerging from the possibility of being able to be appealed to. In the certainty here mentioned lurks the tranquilizing suppression of one's wanting to have a conscience. That is, of understanding one's own most and constant being guilty. The good conscience is neither a self-subsistent form of conscience, nor a founded form of conscience. In short, it is not a conscience phenomenon at all. Insofar as talk about a good conscience arises from everyday Dasein's way of experiencing the conscience, everyday Dasein merely betrays thereby that even when it speaks of the bad conscience, it basically fails to reach the phenomenon. For the idea of the bad conscience is oriented factically by that of the good conscience. The everyday interpretation keeps within the dimension of concernfully reckoning up guilt and innocence, Unschuld, and balancing them off. This, then, is the horizon within which the voice of conscience gets experienced. In characterizing what is primordial in the ideas of bad and good conscience, we have also decided as to the distinction between a conscience which points forward and warns, and one which points back and reproves. The idea of the warning conscience seems, of course, to come closest to the phenomenon of the summons. It shares with this the character of pointing forward. But this agreement is just an illusion. When we experience a warning conscience, the voice is regarded in turn as merely oriented towards the deed which has been willed, from which it seeks to preserve us. But the warning, as a check on what we have willed, is possible only because the warning call is aimed at Dasein's potentiality for being, that is, at its understanding of itself in being guilty. Not until we have such understanding does what we have willed get shattered. The conscience which warns us has the function of regulating from moment to moment our remaining free from indebtedness. In the experience of a warning conscience, the tendency of its call is seen only to the extent that it remains accessible to the common sense of the they. The third consideration which we have mentioned invokes the fact that the everyday experience of the conscience has no acquaintance with anything like getting summoned to being guilty. This must be conceded. But does this everyday experience thus give us any guarantee that the full possible content of the call of the voice of conscience has been heard therein? Does it follow from this that theories of conscience which are based on the ordinary way of experiencing it have made certain that their ontological horizon for analyzing this phenomenon is an appropriate one? Does not falling, which is an essential kind of being for Dasein, show us rather that ontically this entity understands itself proximally and for the most part in terms of the horizon of concern, but that ontologically it defines being in the sense of presence at hand? This, however, leads to covering up the phenomenon in two ways. What one sees in this theory is a sequence of experiences, or psychical processes, a sequence whose kind of being is for the most part wholly indefinite. In such experience the conscience is encountered as an arbiter and admonisher, with whom Dasein reckons and pleads its cause. When Kant represented the conscience as a court of justice, and made this the basic guiding idea in his interpretation of it, he did not do so by accident. This was suggested by the idea of moral law, although his conception of morality was far removed from utilitarianism and eudaimonism. Even the theory of value, whether it is regarded formally or materially, has as its unexpressed ontological presupposition a metaphysic of morals, that is, an ontology of Dasein and existence. Dasein is regarded as an entity with which one might concern oneself, whether this concern has the sense of actualizing values or of satisfying a norm. If one is to invoke the full range of what the everyday experience of conscience, as the only higher court for the interpretation of conscience, is acquainted with, this cannot be justified unless one has considered beforehand whether the conscience can ever become authentically accessible here at all. Thus the further objection that the existential interpretation overlooks the fact that the call of conscience always relates itself to some definite deed which has been either actualized or willed, also loses its force. It cannot be denied that the call is often experienced as having such a tendency. It remains questionable only whether this experience of the call permits it to proclaim itself fully. In the common sense interpretation one may suppose that one is sticking to the facts, but in the end, by its very common sense, this interpretation has restricted the call's disclosive range. As little as the good conscience lets itself be put in the service of a Pharisaism, just as little may the function of the bad conscience be reduced to indicating indebtednesses which are present at hand, or thrusting aside those which are possible. This would be as if Dasein were a household, whose indebtednesses simply needed to be balanced off in an orderly manner, so that the self may stand by as a disinterested spectator, while these experiences run their course. If, however, that which is primary in the call is not a relatedness to a guilt which is factically present at hand, or to some guilt-charged deed which has been factically willed, and if accordingly the reproving and warning types of conscience express no primordial call functions, then we have also undermined the consideration we mentioned first, that the existential interpretation fails to recognize the essentially critical character of what the conscience does. This consideration, too, is one that springs from catching sight of the phenomenon in a manner which, within certain limits, is genuine. For in the content of the call one can indeed point to nothing which the voice positively recommends and imposes. But how are we to understand this positivity which is missing in what the conscience does? Does it follow from this that conscience has a negative character? We miss a positive content in that which is called, because we expect to be told something currently useful about assured possibilities of taking action, which are available and calculable. This expectation has its basis within the horizon of that way of interpreting which belongs to common sense concern, a way of interpreting which forces Dasein's existence to be subsumed under the idea of a business procedure that can be regulated. Such expectations, and in part these tacitly underlie even the demand for a material ethic of value, as contrasted with one that is merely formal, are of course disappointed by the conscience. The call of conscience fails to give any such practical injunctions, solely because it summons Dasein to existence, to its ownmost potentiality for being itself. With the maxims which one might be led to expect, maxims which could be reckoned up unequivocally, the conscience would deny to existence nothing less than the very possibility of taking action. But because the conscience manifestly cannot be positive in this manner, neither does it function just negatively in the same manner. The call discloses nothing which could be either positive or negative as something with which we can concern ourselves. For what it has in view is a being which is ontologically quite different, namely existence. On the other hand, when the call is rightly understood, it gives us that which in the existential sense is the most positive of all, namely the ownmost possibility which Dasein can present to itself, as a calling back, which calls it forth into its factical potentiality for being itself at the time. To hear the call authentically signifies bringing oneself into a factical taking action, but only by setting forth the existential structure implied in our understanding of the appeal. When we hear it authentically, shall we obtain a fully adequate interpretation of what is called in the call. We must first show how the only phenomena with which the ordinary interpretation has any familiarity point back to the primordial meaning of the call of conscience when they are understood in a way that is ontologically appropriate. We must then show that the ordinary interpretation springs from the limitations of the way Dasein interprets itself in falling, and since falling belongs to care itself, we must also show that this interpretation, in spite of all its obviousness, is by no means accidental. In criticizing the ordinary interpretation of the conscience ontologically, one might be subject to the misunderstanding of supposing that if one demonstrates that the everyday way of experiencing the conscience is not existentially primordial, one will have made some judgment as to the existentielle moral quality of any Dasein which maintains itself in that kind of experience. Just as little as existence is necessarily and directly impaired by an ontologically inadequate way of understanding the conscience, so little does an existentially appropriate interpretation of the conscience guarantee that one has understood the call in an existentielle manner. It is no less possible to be serious when one experiences the conscience in the ordinary way than not to be serious when one's understanding of it is more primordial. Nevertheless, the interpretation which is more primordial existentially also discloses possibilities for a more primordial existentielle understanding, as long as our ontological conceptualization does not let itself get cut off from our ontical experience. Ontical experience. Ontical experience. Section 60. The existential structure of the authentic potentiality for being which is attested in the conscience. The existential interpretation of conscience is to exhibit an attestation of Dasein's ownmost potentiality for being, an attestation which is Seiende in Dasein itself. Conscience attests not by making something known in an undifferentiated manner, but by calling forth and summoning us to being guilty. That which is so attested becomes grasped in the hearing, which understands the call undisguisedly, in the sense it has itself intended. The understanding of the appeal is a mode of Dasein's being, and only as such does it give us the phenomenal content of what the call of conscience attests. The authentic understanding of the call has been characterized as wanting to have a conscience. This is a way of letting one's ownmost self take action in itself of its own accord in its being guilty, and represents phenomenally that authentic potentiality for being which Dasein itself attests. The existential structure of this must now be laid bare. Only so can we proceed to the basic constitution of the authenticity of Dasein's existence as disclosed in Dasein itself. Wanting to have a conscience is, as an understanding of oneself in one's ownmost potentiality for being, a way in which Dasein has been disclosed. This disclosedness is constituted by discourse and state of mind, as well as by understanding. To understand in an existentiel manner implies projecting oneself, in each case, upon one's ownmost factical possibility of having the potentiality for being in the world. But the potentiality for being is understood only by existing in this possibility. What kind of mood corresponds to such an understanding? Understanding the call discloses one's own Dasein in the uncanniness of its individualization. The uncanniness, which is revealed in understanding and revealed along with it, becomes genuinely disclosed by the state of mind of anxiety which belongs to that understanding. The fact of the anxiety of conscience gives us phenomenal confirmation that in understanding the call, Dasein is brought face to face with its own uncanniness. Wanting to have a conscience becomes a readiness for anxiety. The third essential item in discloseness is discourse. The call itself is a primordial kind of discourse for Dasein. But there is no corresponding counter-discourse in which, let us say, one talks about what the conscience has said, and pleads one's cause. In hearing the call understandingly, one denies oneself any counter-discourse, not because one has been assailed by some obscure power, which suppresses one's hearing, but because this hearing has appropriated the content of the call unconcealedly. In the call, one's constant being guilty is represented, and in this way the self is brought back from the loud, idle talk, which goes with the common sense of the they. Thus the mode of articulative discourse, which belongs to wanting to have a conscience, is one of reticence. Keeping silent has been characterized as an essential possibility of discourse. Anyone who keeps silent when he wants to give us to understand something must have something to say. In the appeal, Dasein gives itself to understand its ownmost potentiality for being. This calling is therefore a keeping silent. The discourse of the conscience never comes to utterance. Only in keeping silent does the conscience call. That is to say, the call comes from the soundlessness of uncanniness, and the Dasein which it summons is called back into the stillness of itself, and called back as something that is to become still. Only in reticence, therefore, is this silent discourse understood appropriately in wanting to have a conscience. It takes the words away from the common-sense, idle talk of the they. The common-sense way of interpreting the conscience, which sticks rigorously to the facts, takes the silent discourse of the conscience as an occasion for passing it off as something which is not at all ascertainable or present at hand. The fact that they, who hear and understand nothing but loud, idle talk, cannot report any call, is held against the conscience on the subterfuge that it is dumb and manifestly not present at hand. With this kind of interpretation, the they merely covers up its own failure to hear the call, and the fact that its hearing does not reach very far. The discloseness of Dasein in wanting to have a conscience is thus constituted by anxiety as state of mind, by understanding as a projection of oneself upon one's ownmost being guilty, and by discourse as reticence. This distinctive and authentic discloseness, which is attested in Dasein itself by its conscience, this reticent self-projection upon one's ownmost being guilty, in which one is ready for anxiety, we call resoluteness. Resoluteness is a distinctive mode of Dasein's discloseness. In an earlier passage, however, we have interpreted discloseness existentially as the primordial truth. Such truth is primarily not a quality of judgment, nor of any definite way of behaving, but something essentially constitutive for being in the world as such. Truth must be conceived as a fundamental existentiale. In our ontological clarification of the proposition that Dasein is in the truth, we have called attention to the primordial discloseness of this entity as the truth of existence, and for the delimitation of its character, we have referred to the analysis of Dasein's authenticity. In resoluteness we have now arrived at that truth of Dasein which is most primordial because it is authentic. Whenever a there is disclosed its whole being in the world, that is to say the world, being in, and the self, which, as an I am, this entity is disclosed with equal primordiality. Whenever the world is disclosed, entities within the world have been discovered already. The discoveredness of the ready-to-hand and the present-at-hand is based on the disclosedness of the world, for if the current totality of involvements is to be freed, this requires that significance be understood beforehand. In understanding significance, concernful Dasein submits itself circumspectively to what it encounters as ready-to-hand. Any discovering of a totality of involvements goes back to a for the sake of which, and on the understanding of such a for the sake of which is based in turn the understanding of significance as the disclosedness of the current world. In seeking shelter, sustenance, livelihood, we do so for the sake of constant possibilities of Dasein which are very close to it. Upon these, the entity for which its own being is an issue has already projected itself. Thrown into its there, every Dasein has been factically submitted to a definite world, its world. At the same time, those factical projections which are closest to it have been guided by its concernful lostness in the they. To this lostness one's own Dasein can appeal, and this appeal can be understood in the way of resoluteness. But in that case this authentic discloseness modifies with equal primordiality both the way in which the world is discovered, and this is founded upon that discloseness, and the way in which the Dasein with of others is disclosed. The world which is ready-to-hand does not become another one in its content, nor does the circle of others get exchanged for a new one. But both one's being towards the ready-to-hand, understandingly and concernfully, and one's solicitous being with others, are now given a definite character in terms of their ownmost potentiality for being their selves. Resoluteness, as authentic being oneself, does not detach Dasein from its world, nor does it isolate it so that it becomes a free-floating I. And how should it when resoluteness as authentic discloseness is authentically nothing else than being in the world? Resoluteness brings the self right into its current concernful being alongside what is ready to hand, and pushes it into solicitous being with others. In the light of the for the sake of which of one's self-chosen potentiality for being, resolute Dasein frees itself for its world. Dasein's resoluteness towards itself is what first makes it possible to let the others, who are with it, be in their ownmost potentiality for being, and to co-disclose this potentiality in the solicitude which leaps forth and liberates. When Dasein is resolute, it can become the conscience of others. Only by authentically being themselves in resoluteness can people authentically be with one another, not by ambiguous and jealous stipulations and talkative fraternizing in the they and in what they want to undertake. Resoluteness, by its ontological essence, is always the resoluteness of some factical Dasein at a particular time. The essence of Dasein as an entity is its existence. Resoluteness exists only as a resolution, Entschluss, which understandingly projects itself. But on what basis does Dasein disclose itself in resoluteness? On what is it to resolve? Only the resolution itself can give the answer. One would completely misunderstand the phenomenon of resoluteness if one should want to suppose that this consists simply in taking up possibilities which have been proposed and recommended, and seizing hold of them. The resolution is precisely the disclosive projection and determination of what is factically possible at the time. To resoluteness, the indefiniteness characteristic of every potentiality for being, into which Dasein has been factically thrown, is something that necessarily belongs. Only in a resolution is resoluteness sure of itself. The existentielle indefiniteness of resoluteness never makes itself definite except in a resolution, yet it has all the same its existential definiteness. What one resolves upon in resoluteness has been prescribed ontologically in the existentiality of Dasein in general as a potentiality for being in the manner of concernful solicitude. As care, however, Dasein has been determined by facticity and falling. Disclosed in its there, it maintains itself both in truth and in untruth with equal primordiality. This really holds in particular for resoluteness as authentic truth. Resoluteness appropriates untruth authentically. Dasein is already in irresoluteness, Unentschlossenheit, and soon perhaps will be in it again. The term irresoluteness merely expresses that phenomenon which we have interpreted as a being surrendered to the way in which things have been prevalently interpreted by the they. Dasein, as a they-self, gets lived by the common-sense ambiguity of that publicness in which nobody resolves upon anything, but which has always made its decision. Resoluteness signifies letting oneself be summoned out of one's lostness in the they. The irresoluteness of the they remains dominant notwithstanding, but it cannot impugn resolute existence. In the counter-concept to irresoluteness as existentially understood, we do not have in mind any ontico-psychical characteristic in the sense of being burdened with inhibitions. Even resolutions remain dependent upon the they and its world. The understanding of this is one of the things that a resolution discloses, inasmuch as resoluteness is what first gives authentic transparency to Dasein. In resoluteness, the issue for Dasein is its ownmost potentiality for being, which, as something thrown, can project itself only upon definite factical possibilities. Resolution does not withdraw itself from actuality, but discovers first what is factically possible, and it does so by seizing upon it in whatever way is possible for it as its ownmost potentiality for being in the they. The existential attributes of any possible resolute Dasein include the items constitutive for an existential phenomenon which we call a situation, and which we have hitherto passed over. In the term situation, to be in a situation, there is an overtone of a signification that is spatial. We shall not try to eliminate this from the existential conception, for such an overtone is also implied in the there of Dasein. Being in the world has a spatiality of its own, characterized by the phenomena of deseverance and directionality. Dasein makes room insofar as it factically exists. But spatiality of the kind which belongs to Dasein, and on the basis of which existence always determines its location, is grounded in the state of being in the world, for which discloseness is primarily constitutive. Just as the spatiality of the there is grounded in discloseness, the situation has its foundations in resoluteness. The situation is the there which is disclosed in resoluteness, the there as which the existent entity is there. It is not a framework present at hand in which Dasein occurs, or into which it might even just bring itself. Far removed from any present-at-hand mixture of circumstances and accidents which we encounter, the situation is only through resoluteness and in it. The current factical involvement character of the circumstances discloses itself to the self only when that involvement character is such that one has resolved upon the there as which that self, in existing, has to be. When what we call accidents befall from the with world and the environment, they can befall only resoluteness. For the they, however, the situation is essentially something that has been closed off. The they knows only the general situation, loses itself in those opportunities which are closest to it, and pays Dasein's way by a reckoning up of accidents which it fails to recognize, deems its own achievement, and passes off as such. Resoluteness brings the being of the there into the existence of its situation. Indeed, it delimits the existential structure of that authentic potentiality for being, which the conscience attests, wanting to have a conscience. In this potentiality we have recognized the appropriate way of understanding the appeal. This makes it entirely plain that when the call of conscience summons us to our potentiality for being, it does not hold before us some empty ideal of existence, but calls us forth into the situation. This existential positivity, which the call of conscience possesses when rightly understood, gives us at the same time an insight. It makes us see to what extent we fail to recognize the disclosive character of the conscience if the tendency of the call is restricted to indebtednesses which have already occurred or which we have before us. It also makes us see to what extent the concrete understanding of the voice of conscience is only seemingly transmitted to us if this restriction is made. When our understanding of the appeal is interpreted existentially as resoluteness, the conscience is revealed as that kind of being, included in the very basis of Dasein, in which Dasein makes possible for itself its factical existence, thus attesting its ownmost potentiality for being. This phenomenon which we have exhibited as resoluteness can hardly be confused with an empty habitus or an indefinite velleity. Resoluteness does not first take cognizance of a situation and put that situation before itself. It has put itself into that situation already. As resolute, Dasein is already taking action. The term take action is one which we are purposely avoiding. For in the first place this term must be taken so broadly that activity, Aktivität, will also embrace the passivity of resistance. In the second place it suggests a misunderstanding in the ontology of Dasein, as if resoluteness were a special way of behavior belonging to the practical faculty, as contrasted with one that is theoretical. Care, however, as concern for solicitude, so primordially and wholly envelops Dasein's being that it must already be presupposed as a whole when we distinguish between theoretical and practical behavior. It cannot first be built up out of these faculties by a dialectic which, because it is existentially ungrounded, is necessarily quite baseless. Resoluteness, however, is only that authenticity which, in care, is the object of care, in der Sorge Gesorgte, and which is possible as care, the authenticity of care itself. To present the factical existentielle possibilities in their chief features and interconnections, and to interpret them according to their existential structure, falls among the tasks of a thematic existential anthropology. For the purposes of the present investigation, as a study of fundamental ontology, it is enough if that authentic potentiality for being, which conscience attests for Dasein itself in terms of Dasein itself, is defined existentially. Now that resoluteness has been worked out as being guilty, a self-projection in which one is reticent and ready for anxiety, our investigation has been put in a position for defining the ontological meaning of that potentiality which we have been seeking, Dasein's authentic potentiality for being a whole. By now the authenticity of Dasein is neither an empty term nor an idea which someone has fabricated. But even so, as an authentic potentiality for being a whole, the authentic being towards death, which we have deduced existentially, still remains a purely existential project for which Dasein's attestation is missing. Only when such attestation has been found will our investigation suffice to exhibit, as its problematic requires, an authentic potentiality for being a whole, existentially confirmed and clarified, a potentiality which belongs to Dasein. For only when this entity has become phenomenally accessible in its authenticity and its totality will the question of the meaning of the being of this entity, to whose existence there belongs in general an understanding of being, be based upon something which will stand any test. Test.